So, players out there, I'm sure you guys have come to your Dungeon Master every now and then and given them some kind of request. You know, like this homebrew subclass would be really perfect for my build, or this race really fits my character vision. And in turn, Dungeon Masters out there, I'm sure you guys have had to look through these requests, much like a monarch reviewing the courtly appearances of their peasants, and thought to yourself about whether or not you should approve the requests of your player characters. This can be pretty stressful, let's be honest with ourselves. You don't want to let your players down, but at the same time, you want your game to have a coherent vision, and if you care about game balance, you definitely need to be careful around homebrew mechanics that might throw that off. So, what requests are worth letting into your game, and more importantly, how do you deny requests that don't work in your game? Well, today I have a bunch of requests made to DMs on Reddit, requests that aren't exactly great, and we're using them as the vehicle by which to see how and why you should say no to certain player requests. Without further ado, let's get started. Okay, first up, I had a player keep making special requests to multiclass and get weird perks to play a ranger without actually being a ranger. She wanted to be a frontline fighter with a bow and an animal companion, but refused to take any levels in ranger to do that. Instead, she had this weird druid sorcerer multiclass and kept asking for exceptions on armor and weapon restrictions and more HP, and it was a mess. Look, I understand not wanting to play Ranger because, oh, it's famous for being underpowered, but if your response to that is to play a super messy multiclass that also is probably underpowered, well, we might have some problems. Look, multiclassing is one of the coolest parts of Dungeons & Dragons. As I've grown more familiar with other games and enjoyed other games, I found myself often coming back to multiclassing as one of the things that makes D&D very special, the flexibility to build your character with all these different components. However, with 12 classes in base D&D, it is not going to be easy. In fact, it's near impossible for all of them to work coherently together. And yeah, this multi-class setup doesn't sound great. Sometimes, players out there, it is better for your vision, both for the build and for perhaps even the story, if you just stick to a single class, maybe? I once had a guy come into my game with an idea for a survivalist wizard character, and he wanted to take an inexplicable level in Ranger, actually, because of this. And I always thought to myself, like, why? I told him from the get-go that this was a decently hardcore game. The likelihood of death is high, so he needs to make a build that can withstand that. And a wizard with strength as the main stat, with a ranger multi-spec that doesn't really add much, it was not a great idea, I'm going to be honest with you. And I told him as much. I didn't want to just say, hey, your build sucks. But I did recommend that he adjust some of the stats. At the very least, make intelligence the main stat of the wizard so that he doesn't get nuked the first second he enters my combats. Again, multiclassing is awesome, and I recommend people who play D&D engage in multiclass. But if your multiclass requires a bunch of exceptions from the Dungeon Master on specific class features, you might need to consider that just taking a single class might be a lot better for both your build, for your vision, and for the sanity of your Dungeon Master. Next up, I had a player at the end of a session say to me, my Bladesinger has a low armor class, so I would love some better armor if that's okay, DM. I haven't had a player specifically ask for magic item before, but hey, I improv a whole magic island with a temple dungeon, and it has a +1 light armor in it. That would be perfect for your Bladesinger. Oh, but he already has a +1 armor. Okay, I'm gonna work under the assumption that the +1 armor inside this magic dungeon is not a duplicate and is in fact a better piece of armor. If it is a duplicate, then that's on both the Bladesinger and on the DM. The Bladesinger should be communicating what they have in their inventory, and the DM should be paying attention to what's in the inventory of their player characters. So, assuming that the DM granted the Bladesinger's request and gave them a better piece of armor and they just, like, didn't take it, Yeah, that's frustrating. And it has happened to me before. I've had player characters request things from me. Much more complicated things than a +1 to their armor class. Complicated magical items that do specific things for their build. I homebrew them up and implement them into the game, and 9 times out of 10, my player characters love it. But one time, my infamous wizard problem player asked for a homebrew necromancer subclass. I made it, and I gave it to them. It was my first homebrew thing I'd ever really made. And yeah, I wasn't perfect, but I worked hard on it. And he really didn't like it. Mostly because he didn't think it was overpowered enough. And that hurt. That sucked. I was open to constructive criticism because, again, it was my first time ever DMing and ever homebrewing. So I guarantee it genuinely did suck. But I was still a new DM trying my best, and to just get upset at me for not making it overpowered enough and just throwing it back in my face, that sucks. We as DMs try our best to implement the requests that player characters give, and this was a reasonable request. A simple like +1 to AC, that is not anything that's gonna blow up the game, even though Bladesinger as a subclass might actually blow up the game, but that's beside the point. Look, the DM acquiesced to a reasonable request, and the Bladesinger just sort of tossed it back in their face. That is rude. As players, you should remember what you request from your DM, and if they don't do it to your satisfaction, talk to them about it. Don't get upset at them, because I guarantee your Dungeon Master isn't trying to screw you over by not doing your request well enough. We are all amateurs just trying our best. We're not Matt Mercer able to homebrew something perfect every single time. So be patient with your DM, especially when they're trying to implement something for you. Okay, next up, Creeper player who asked the Dungeon Master to let his character have sex with another player's character. The target of this was being played by a lesbian woman whose lesbian partner also played in the game. Target was so uncomfortable with his advances on her that she refused to discuss it. So he asked the DM to just let him fake bang someone else's wife in front of them. Oh my god, is this RPG Horror Stories? What the fuck? Okay, oh my god. Took me a second to even figure out a lesson here. But I think the lesson here is that, look, sometimes as Dungeon Master, if you get a request that is genuinely just this bad, they should not be sticking around in the game. The stuff the player characters ask of you as the DM can sometimes expose a lot about their playstyle, even before the game begins. That problem player wizard I mentioned earlier, he had a backstory that was very power leveled for level 1. I mean, he was talking about killing an adult black dragon. That is very different from the level 1 Curse of Strahd campaign that we were engaging in. So that should have been a red flag. Look, this isn't just a red flag. This is like a whole army, a red armada, so to speak, and the DM should be paying attention to that. If somebody is being creepy at the game table, they should not stick around, period. Now, the other lesson beyond the red flags lies in romantic relationships at the game table. Look, if you want to do a romantic plot line, that's awesome. That's okay. I've talked about this before, but I do a romantic plot line with fall cosplay between our characters, Yumi and Cleo, and it's a lot of fun. I love those roleplay interactions. They're some of my favorites I've ever done in any D&D campaign ever. So I get the allure of doing a romance. But here's the key difference. Both me and Fall want to do that. We both consent. Clearly, this is not something that the Creeper player was doing. Not that he'd want to. Some people just, I don't know, get off on the idea of not getting consent, and that is not something you should ever allow in your game. Next up, out of game, a potential new player want to run some homebrew by me that 3 other DMs approved of. First of all, was a barely disguised slime fetish involving absorption. Seriously, guys, this isn't RPG Horror Stories. What are you doing? Second, it was broken in terms of power, a healing cantrip, dex and con save proficiency, infinite spell slots, and hit points provided there were enemies, and more than that I don't even remember. But broken in terms of functionality too. The class had 1 feature and the rest were all custom spells that were just buffed normal spells. Okay, we're not going to pay attention to the creepy slime stuff because we basically already talked about that. but we're all going to talk about the OP aspect of this. Look, as a dungeon master, you are at some point going to be asked to run through some homebrew mechanics, a homebrew feat, homebrew class. And as a dungeon master, I think you should be allowed to reserve the right to say, no, I don't want to do that. I implement a lot of homebrew into my games myself. Homebrew that I make, homebrew that I want to review, like Homebrew Monsters from the Flea Mortals MCDM book. My players are well aware that that is where a lot of my focus is. I don't always have time to look through a dozen homebrew spells or entire homebrew specs, especially since, look, as a DM, you can review the balance of things in advance. Like, I make monsters and then I put them into my game. I can't always rigorously playtest every single creature I create for Draw Steel or D&D 5e. It's not always possible. And oftentimes, when I implement stuff like that, it can catch me off guard with it being underpowered or overpowered. It's happened both ways countless times. Now, with a monster, I think that is another side of the coin from a player character class, because a monster is probably only going to appear in 1-2 sessions, right? Like most of my bosses, they appear in the session where they fight, and then they're probably dead, right? But a player character class, that's something that is in the entire campaign. Most people play one character through the campaign and stick to a class, and that means that you gotta deal with that class or subclass the entire time. And if it's super overpowered or super underpowered, that's something that you are going to need to handle. And you're not always going to know that until you're really deep into it already. So I think DMs should be okay with saying, like, look, I am going to implement some homebrew, but it's homebrew that I am actively reviewing on my end. If you want to review homebrew subclasses, I think that is really, really great. A lot of homebrew subclasses out there are awesome, but I have in the past approved homebrew classes or subclasses and then regretted it later on. Regretted it not in any super major ways, but more so just minor annoyances, because frankly, not every homebrew class or subclass knocks out of the park, man. I mean, that's just, like, I don't know how to say it. That's just the truth, especially when it comes to game balance. You just gotta keep an eye on that. And don't be afraid to say, and just don't be afraid to say no to stuff. Whether it's because it's overpowered or because you just don't have the time. One of my players wrote a backstory about her character being assaulted by her uncle at 15 years old for age 6. A full page just about that. Okay, my God, put this on my other channel, jeez. And then she said, but after that, an evil goddess made a contract with me, giving me a crossbow that dealt 2d12 plus 6 fire damage. She wrote that into her backstory, so then she killed her evil uncle. Okay, so kind of impossible for me not to talk about the creepy stuff here, and the frank fact is, backstories are, again, one of those things as a DM, you probably are going to have to approve, and looking through backstories can often be the most fun part of being a dungeon master. I love hearing about the awesome ideas that my players have. Sometimes, though, their ideas are not so awesome, this being a great example. A lot of my characters, personally, do have darker backstories. Kalia and Yumi both have themes of abuse in their stories. Not to this degree, but definitely stuff that could make people uncomfortable. I did not give the backstories for Kalia and Yumi or any of my other more, I guess, risque characters to my players. I didn't need to spoil everything, but I did generally say, like, hey, there are themes of trauma, there are themes of abuse in this campaign. Are you okay with that? And they said yes. Hence why campaigns like Shadow over Karakonos and the 10th Tomb worked out and were not horrible disasters. If that kind of content was sprung on them unexpectedly, that may have been quite unpleasant. And frankly, as a dungeon master, if I read this, that is immediately going through my head. Now, besides that, the NSFW content being used to justify an overpowered starter magical item, that is another problem entirely. As a DM, I actually like giving my players weaker magical items. I have a massive library of D&D 5e magical items that I've made and curated from various sources, but the point is I really like homebrew magic items. On the other hand, though, I don't want my player characters to start out super OP, which is why I give them a selection of magic items. Like, hey, you can choose from these. I generally am not going to allow you to just like Google a magic item and say, hey, can I have this? I mean, I'll let you try, but I'm not usually going to say yes. Like, look, I have a library of hundreds. I'm sure you will find something in there that you'll like, okay? This 2d12 plus 6 crossbow, it is a ridiculously overpowered ranged weapon that obviously would not be allowed by any reasonable dungeon master, especially at first level. Combine that with a backstory that would make even the hardiest of DMs uncomfortable and definitely creep out at least one of your player characters, and yeah, you have the recipe for disaster. That means this person might not even be let into the game. Look, your backstory might be the first impression you give your dungeon master. Leaving this as the first impression, it's not a good sign for the rest of your playstyle, man. But yeah, those are 5 player character requests. Now, for the players out there, what did we learn here? Well, for starters, don't be weird to your table or to your dungeon master. Don't include content that's going to make people super uncomfortable. And make sure to be okay when your DM says no to your request. Look, there are DMs out there who are like petulant children. They whine and scream and say no to everything like they are a kid with a new babysitter on a power trip. And that is not fun. But if your DM explains the reason why they say no and it makes sense, try to be honest with yourself and let the request go. Be open to that discussion. Look, I don't think DMs should hard no every single request. I've rarely, if ever, done that. It's just sometimes player character requests need to be modified somewhat. Maybe just a slight edit to the backstory. Make it a little less NSFW. You know, an edit to this magic item. Turn down the damage somewhat. Stuff like that. Rarely do you need a hard no. And being open to that discussion will allow you to get something really fun out of the game. But just being combative in response to any sort of denial, that might get you booted out of the game entirely. Now, on the other hand of that, DMs out there, even though I've been advocating for a lot of saying no to these requests, and some of them do deserve a hard no, don't get me wrong, at the same time, stuff like a slightly overpowered item or a subclass doesn't fit into your world, don't just say no. Say no, but, you know, be open to changing up some of the requests to make it fit more into your game. Rare is the request that cannot be edited to fit into whatever world you are trying to build. All right. Whew. So that is the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Crispy's Academy. If you guys did, you might enjoy our latest episode of RPG Horror Stories. We referenced it a few times in this episode, but yeah, the series is back on Crispy's Tavern. It's linked up in the cards, but before you go, please do subscribe to Crispy's Academy and leave a like on this one if you enjoyed it. And finally, if you want to leave your own advice or thoughts, you can go down in the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment by your request to let me know at the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. We will see you all next time. Farewell. Oh, God, I usually wear a suit to these videos. Oh my God.